Hi, welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan. With us today for one question is the president of Demand Justice, the new president of Demand Justice, Josh Orton. Josh has been someone I've known for a long time, but the long active political involvement from Vice President Harris to Senator Sanders to Senator Russ Feingold from my home state. So Josh, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Congressman.
So, Josh, my question for you is if you could change any one federal law, anything, you don't have to go through Mike Johnson or Jim Jordan or anyone else, you could just do it. What would that one change be, and why would that be the change that you'd make?
So this is not going to be just related to judicial nominations, but
Sure.
I think
No,
it will
no.
be it will be in line with sort of our shared Wisconsin history and sort of the values of Bob Lafall and Russ Feingold.
Hmm.
I would change the way that elections are financed so that
Yep.
that there is a public financed system of elections so that the people are represented. And that's a way I think that we would get nominations to the court that were real people who protected the interests of real citizens. We would
Hmm.
have, people who weren't billionaires, running the country. I think that to me would be the most fundamental change that we could make that would benefit all of our federal government and all of our country is to get money out of politics and to finally implement a system of public financing of elections so that real people's voice can be heard.
I'll tell you, this general area is the number one area that people answer with. So it was a good answer. Appreciate it, Josh. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for all the work that Demand Justice does.
Thanks for your work, Congressman.
The Trump administration and Republican majorities in Congress have been unusually antagonistic towards the LGBTQ plus community, despite growing public support for equality. We've seen some of the greatest attacks against the trans community here in the United States, but perhaps less seen have been the attacks globally through the sudden reversal of support for equality by the United States government. It's in this area that people in the US may think their lives here aren't impacted directly, but indeed they are. And we have a very special guest with us today to discuss not just this important premise, but also to give a state of play of equality around the world. Our guest today has an impressive and unique resume. President Obama was such a strong supporter of equality for the LGBTQ plus community that he created a unique position within the U.S. government, a special envoy to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons. That position, so unique that only a handful existed around the world, led U.S. foreign policy to protect the queer community from violence and discrimination globally. It was first led by Special Envoy Randy Barry from 2015 until 2017, when Trump began his first presidential term. That position was then vacant until President Biden filled the position again in June of 2021 with a very exciting person. I've had the opportunity to work with this special person, and I can tell you it was a crucially important position for our government to have. Jessica Stern was the special envoy, and her resume and background made her uniquely qualified for that position. Prior to joining the Department of State, she led Outright International as its executive director, releasing important reports about the treatment of LGBTQ plus people across the globe. She also worked with a number of other groups, including the United Nations, on this type of important work. Now, Stern is the co-founder of the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice. We are honored to be joined today by Jessica Stern. Welcome, Jessica.
The Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice was co-founded by 8 ambassadors, special representatives, and special envoys. Each held a different human rights portfolio during the Biden administration. And so our areas of expertise spanned workers' rights, youth empowerment, trafficking in persons, global criminal justice, fighting racism, fighting for women's rights and gender equality, and of course, my goal for LGBTQI. And we worked really closely together during the Biden administration because we found that one of our priorities was elevating human rights across
Mhm.
the entire foreign policy establishment. And then we decided to get together on January 21st, the day after President Trump had been sworn in, to kind of do a postmortem. And Mark, I don't have to tell you that within the first 24 hours, President Trump had already wielded the power of his office to redefine US foreign policy. And so we sat down as a group of friends and colleagues for a lunch, and we walked out of there with an action plan. And so what the alliance is doing is really trying to elevate the importance of human rights in U.S. foreign policy, short and long term.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the work in founding that organization. And yeah, who'd have knew what we know now, what Donald Trump has done to everything that we had worked so long on internationally, on the values of the United States. Um, let's specifically go to the broader subject of LGBTQ plus rights. Tell us about that special envoy position you had under President Biden, what that meant for equality, and yeah, I think the big question is what that meant for everybody here in the United States to have that position.
I was really proud to be the U.S. Special Envoy for LGBTQI plus rights. It meant that I was reflecting American laws in our foreign policy and really explaining American values. And the North Star for my work was fighting discrimination and violence against LGBTQI plus people around the world. You really can't imagine some of the horrors that I saw in that role. Intervening when police didn't want to investigate when a trans person was murdered, you know, engaging to ensure that LGBTQI people had access to humanitarian relief after an earthquake or a tsunami, um, responding quickly when a horrific, dehumanizing bill was introduced to a parliament to say to another country, this is going to be a problem in our bilateral relationship.
Mm.
So I felt really honored to do that work, and it was consequential. Um, what your listeners should know and should know with pride is that the US has a huge impact around the world. So when we say this is a human rights abuse, other countries listen. And the result was that we were able to protect LGBTQI people in some of the most dangerous places on earth.
So for someone who, never heard of the position, never knew the work was done, how would you best describe why it was important to them that their government had this position?
Well, let's pretend I'm talking to someone who doesn't care at all about LGBTQI issues. They're like, why are my taxpayer dollars going into an issue like that? I think that's a great question to ask. I mean, the simple answer is because the test of the rule of law is how it treats the most vulnerable, not how it treats the most privileged. And if we have a double standard for one group, then the truth is we have a double standard for every group.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that LGBTQI people are not subjected to worse treatment than anybody else, because today it's them, tomorrow it could be you.
You shared just a couple things that happened during your tenure, but can you talk a little bit about some of the most memorable successes you had while in that position?
Sure. I'll give you a smattering of examples. I'm going to omit countries, but I'll describe circumstance.
Gotcha.
So there's a country that has a sodomy law on the books, and the sodomy law criminalizes homosexual sex between men. You can't believe these laws still exist,
Mhm.
much less are being applied in 2024 or 2025. But there are 60 countries around the world that still have sodomy laws on the books.
60. Okay.
So I think we would agree that's way too many.
Yeah.
So we had a conversation with another government, and we said, as part of our overall stance on human rights, we just have to tell you this law is problematic. And we know that you're looking at judicial reform. It seems like this is one of the laws that should be removed from the books. And they said, well, we're probably not going to decriminalize homosexuality anytime soon. But guess what? We're never going to apply it. Cross my heart. It exists in name only, but it has no impact on people's lives. We said, if you say so, but we're going to remember that you said that.
Yeah.
So then we went and we talked to members of the community, and they said, look, on a practical level, this law dehumanizes us. It makes it harder to talk to our families about our loved ones. It makes it harder to be out at work or to feel safe at school, but at least the law is not being applied every day. Well, then I got a call in the middle of the night, and a young gay man was arrested,
Mm.
and they were going to charge him with sodomy. And if he'd been convicted, he would have languished in prison for years of his life.
Wow.
So what did we do? We called that government and we said, remember, you made a promise to us. You said this law exists in name only, but you weren't going to apply it. what do you think of this case? And they said, let us look into it. And before the end of the month, the charges were dropped.
It's great. It's great. And I know that from my many conversations with you during this time that you were in the position, there were a lot of other stories too that just had the US not been there with its moral presence, a lot of people would have been very negatively affected.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the success that comes from the US's engagement is in preventing bad things happen from
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
So there was one country that I have worked on for many years, including when I was a human rights activist before going into government. They were considering passing a law that would criminalize homosexuality with the death penalty.
Mm.
And I just, I not only am I opposed to the death penalty in general, I couldn't conceive that in this era
Mhm.
that a country would be passing a new law that would punish homosexuality with death. I mean, it defies the imagination. The US raised it in our bilateral conversations with this government. Why did we raise it? Because governments talk to each other about everything. We talk
Yeah.
about trade, we talk about security, we talk about human rights. And when we said this law is problematic, but especially the death penalty provisions, people took note. Unfortunately, a version of the law did pass,
Mm.
but the version of the law that passed only, in air quotes, sends LGBTQI people who've been convicted to jail for 5 to 7 years. That's not acceptable by any measure, but it's a whole lot better than being sentenced to death.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's do that. I think this is interesting because it was interesting when I had a chance to talk to you about what is it like in different parts, different regions of the world. So if I can just go through a couple areas and just tell me what is the state of play for equality in some of these areas. And, here I think maybe we even can mention countries if you feel like it, names, because I think it's good for people to understand that number of 60 countries that still have laws on the books on this. I mean, it's a very real situation for people around the world. So let's start with an area that people probably know the most. How about tell us what's the state of play in the United States and Europe, for example?
Okay, good question. All right, I'm smiling because we could spend hours on this,
Right.
but I think I'm gonna pivot to, just being really honest with you. After many years of momentum forward for LGBTQI people in the US and in, parts of Europe, progress has, in my estimation, stalled and in some places is going
Yeah.
backwards.
No, I
Yeah,
agree.
I mean, the number of LGBTQI Americans that I speak with who tell me that they feel unsafe is unlike anything that I can remember in my lifetime. And initially, I thought it was just a couple of people, but the number of friends and colleagues that I hear are considering leaving the United States because they don't feel safe as LGBTQI Americans or they don't feel safe raising their families here. It just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
So the situation in the US is not good, whether it's attacks on transgender people's access to healthcare, like in the Supreme Court ruling in the Scrimeti decision, or the kind of relentless dehumanization of LGBTQI people, but especially trans Americans that we hear from our president is shocking. And it should shock everyone. I don't care if your best friend is trans or you've never met a trans person. It is not in our collective best interests as Americans to tolerate a president who attacks a particular kind of person who's just trying to live their lives.
Yeah.
And this threat that there's a perception that transgender Americans and people that believe in transgender rights are somehow agents of terrorism. It just couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah.
What is American? Dissent is American. Fighting for civil rights is American.
Yeah.
So the situation in the US is really bad. In Europe, it's sort of it's a diverse situation.
Okay.
A couple years ago, Latvia legalized marriage equality. Um, right now, the government of Spain just established a special envoy for LGBTQI rights, which is
Oh,
amazing.
yeah.
In a relatively small Catholic country, you're taking steps forward while the US is taking steps backwards.
Yeah.
So that gives me a bit of hope. But then there are other places that have been in the news, like a lot of your listeners probably have been following what's been happening in Hungary,
Right.
where earlier this year the government attempted to ban all pride events. But I'll just give you a little bit of hope. The government tried to ban all pride events, and when Budapest Pride rolled around in June, instead of accepting that and everyone cowering at home and being afraid, they had the biggest pride event in the history of the nation.
Sounds like the No Kings rallies, we recently had, right? Yeah, when you tell people they can't do something they know they have a right to do, people respond. That's great to hear that that happened, but, yeah, I think people normally assume United States, Europe, Australia, those are the safe places, but, we've seen these attacks from Republicans in Congress and from this Trump administration, and in so many states as well, right? State legislative fights that have made it harder and harder for people here in America.
Yeah, the last time I checked, I think it was the ACLU tracker, 616 anti-LGBTQI plus bills had been introduced in different local and state legislatures just in 2025, and they disproportionately target LGBTQI young people, who I would say are already the most vulnerable. So we have to do everything possible to protect them from discrimination and not stigmatize them.
No, exactly, exactly. How about in the Americas? Let's talk about Central and South America. Are there generalities or specifics that you'd like to share?
Well, Um, it's a diverse region, so there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, like
Okay.
everywhere.
All right.
I'll start with the good. St. Lucia is the most recent country in the Caribbean, so I'm including it as a part of the Western Hemisphere to decriminalize homosexuality.
Okay.
So, once upon a time, there was this myth that the Caribbean was the most homophobic place on earth.
Yeah.
And in recent years, the Caribbean has been the region to decriminalize homosexuality at the fastest rate of any region in the world.
Wow, that's great. That is great news. And you and I have had those very specific conversations about the Caribbean too. So that is very good news. How about any other countries worth highlighting, good or bad, in this hemisphere?
I mean, Argentina's obviously been in the news in the
Yeah.
US because of the American bailout of their economy. Argentina's historically been a leader, not just regionally, but globally for LGBTQI plus rights. We owe them a debt of gratitude for really showing us some of the most cutting edge laws to
Wow.
affirm LGBTQI people's rights. They were the first country in the world to establish that a transgender person could change their gender marker on their official documents based on self attestation.
Mhm.
So, no medical intervention necessary, just based on their understanding of
Mm.
themselves. Um, Argentina's also led a lot of the regional and global coalitions fighting for LGBTQI rights, work among governments. Unfortunately, right now, that work has ground to a halt. President Milei's government has stopped all work on LGBTQI equality and actually tried to make claims that that work to counter violence amounts to favoritism or special rights. So
Uh, yeah.
in the Americas, we lost one of our strongest allies.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, no. Well, unfortunately, that closeness to the Trump administration, I think, has an effect, just like we saw in Hungary, right? I mean, some of those countries are trying to appease the United States, and they see this as maybe one of the ways to do that.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that some of the president's closest allies are also the government's most responsible for crackdowns on LGBTQI people.
Yeah.
And, one thing that I would emphasize for your listeners, um, when we talk about the developments in Hungary, we have to understand we're not just keeping up with current events because it's interesting. The playbook of authoritarianism from Hungary and other governments of that ilk is actually being studied by right wing fundamentalists in the United States to justify crackdowns on Americans' rights here at home.
Yeah.
So, what's the playbook in Hungary? Playbook is attack the free press, undermine the independence of universities, and make it hard for NGOs to operate legally or safely. These are the mechanisms for dissent.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, these are the same institutions that the Trump administration is attacking, which is impacting all Americans' daily lives.
Yeah. Uh, one of the more challenging areas has always been the Middle East. What are LGBTQ plus people facing in some of those countries? And do you have any positive news out of that region at all?
You know, that is a region that has some of the smartest, most creative, and most resilient LGBTQI activists of anywhere, hands down. So when you look at the kind of funding that's spent to support equality for LGBTQI people, the US and Europe gets this, the Middle East gets this.
Yeah, very little.
And in spite of that, they hold the line.
Mm.
So you're not going to see any of the major legal advances anytime soon. There's been talks in Lebanon for years. Will they finally decriminalize? Unfortunately, we're not at that time right now.
Yeah.
But we are seeing organizations finding ways to operate in even the hardest circumstance. So when I started working on LGBTQI rights in Iraq, for example,
Yeah.
the only ones that would talk to me were really progressive women's rights organizations because there were no LGBTQI organizations. They didn't even have the space to operate. And today, there are multiple LGBTQI organizations. In fact, there are enough LGBTQI organizations that they don't all get along. And that's the sign of progress.
Yeah. We'll take it. We'll take it. I hear you. Wow. How about Asia? I know Asia is very, very large and very diverse, but are there certain countries to highlight positively or negatively?
Yesterday I read that South Korea has just decided to count same sex couples in their national census,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
which is fantastic news because knowledge is power.
Mhm.
And inclusion in the census has transformative results in the distribution of rights and benefits for people across the country. So we could learn a thing or two from South Korea.
Yeah.
Uh, um, I think it was in September or maybe earlier this month in October, Japan just expanded protections for same sex couples,
Mhm.
including really important resources like access to benefits after a disaster. So things that have a really tangible impact on people's lives. And I was just reading a really excellent publication by my former organization, Outright International, and it's called Rights in Retrograde. And it goes through basically setting court decisions
Mm.
from every region every quarter. And I read that there were 3 really important legal victories in India over the last quarter, which doesn't surprise me because the Indian LGBTQI movement is so strong. But one piece that was really powerful happened when a trans woman, unfortunately, was a victim of domestic violence from her partner.
Mhm.
And she went to the police and tried to hold the perpetrator accountable and tried to bring a case against him. What was his defense? He said, under the domestic violence law, which only applies to women, you don't count as a woman.
Mm.
So you can't be protected under the law. And the court said, not so fast, sided in her favor, and made sure to extend domestic violence protections to transgender women.
Good. And didn't in the last number of years, I believe a few of the Asian countries also had marriage equality happen. I believe Thailand, maybe, and some others, if I remember right.
Yeah, so Taiwan was the first,
Taiwan, yes, yep,
and we were all waiting for Thailand's because Thailand is really, you know,
yeah.
the place where you wanna be. Um, and they have such a strong LGBTQI movement. It almost felt surprising, like, did someone forget to turn the lights on?
Yeah.
Um, but it's been great for Thailand's reputation, and it's been great for their economy. So Thailand and Taiwan are outperforming their neighbors in many tourism categories
Oh, sure.
because people feel safe there. So not only do they go there because they don't feel like they're gonna be harassed, but they're also going there so that they can have their families be respected.
Yeah.
Get that cheesy honeymoon suite that everybody wants.
Yep. All right, the toughest region, without question, I know has been Africa, and um, I remember having some folks in from Uganda at a time they were going through, and they were telling us
privately that, oh, don't worry, it's going to blow away. And it never did. In fact, just the opposite. But try to, as complex as, the area of Africa is, it's large, but I do think most of the laws that we see exist, I think, in the African continent, correct?
The African context is really, it's really in a tough place. Um, Unfortunately, it was one of the regions most impacted by colonialism. And so the sodomy laws that are on the books, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like 35 plus countries in a region of whatever it is, 55 countries still have sodomy laws on the books. So the ratio is too high.
Mhm.
But when you ask what is the origin of those sodomy laws, the answer is the British. Um, so they're actually a colonial inheritance,
Yeah.
but they're still a modern legacy. Um, so it's been quite hard for LGBTQI activists in the region, but they are undaunted. And so, in Kenya, they're fighting for decriminalization,
Mm.
and it has some of the strongest organizations in the region. Of course, Botswana decriminalized a couple of years ago. Namibia decriminalized a couple of years ago. In fact, even though the regional trend is not good, roughly one African country per year for the past decade has struck down its sodomy
So
laws.
that's big. Yeah, that is big. Wow. Great. So when you look at that impact of the United States withdrawing from leadership in this area, are you, since you've left this position early January, are you seeing some slippage because of that?
Oh, there's no doubt about that whatsoever. I mean, I think we could talk about that in two ways. One is the political impact, and the other is the financial impact. Where do you want to start?
Political.
Okay. Um, an East African activist said to me, it used to be when something terrible would happen to an LGBTQI person, I could call you in the middle of the night because I couldn't call anyone in my own government. Now I pick up the phone and you'll answer, but you don't have the authority of the US government to help me in my community. And if I try to call the US government directly, the phone rings, but nobody's home.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's just no question that the US's withdrawal of support in this area and active dehumanization of LGBTQI people
Mhm.
is celebrated by dictators and human rights abusers around the world. I mean, in fact, the day after Trump was named the US president, across Uganda, some of the biggest uh, abusers of the rights of LGBTQI people celebrated and said, finally, we'll get a break from the US holding us to international human rights standards. So they feel like they have a partner in crime and a blank check.
Right. And then
And
financially, you said?
and then financially, it's been completely devastating. I mean, the US stopped all foreign assistance with a series of executive orders and actions after Trump became president. And then it turned the spigot back on, but at a trickle. And there weren't any LGBTQI projects that made it through that trickle of support. In fact, not only did the U.S. Uh, fail to fail to fulfill existing grants and contracts, um, grassroots LGBTQI organizations suddenly had to fight to reclaim funds that they'd already spent under U.S. government contracts. I mean, it's incomprehensible. It's like, if I go to the gas station, I fill up my car with gas, and then I drive around, and then I'm like, "Oh, you wanted me to pay you for that?" Ugh,
Yeah.
I just enjoy I can't believe it. So
Yeah.
the consequence has been, organizations have had to lay off staff, they've had to close programs. And for those that don't work with NGOs, they might be thinking like, what does that really matter? Well, I'll tell you what it matters. It means that when LGBTQI people are arbitrarily arrested, there's no one to go to the police station and make sure they're not mistreated in jail. When LGBTQI people try to go to a doctor, there's no doctor that's willing to provide care without discrimination. when an LGBTQI person is beaten up on the street, they have no one to turn to because the organization that used to support them isn't there. Um, that by some estimates, the US, because of the size of our economy, was funding maybe even a third of the global LGBTQI plus movement through a broad range of programs. You can't replace that overnight. And
Right.
so the consequences have been absolutely devastating. And, we're not talking about a couple of pride parties not happening. We're literally talking about victims of violence not getting the justice they deserve. That's the consequence of the US withdrawal. And cumulatively, there's no question that it will result in, increased deaths in LGBTQI people and people living with HIV.
We talked a little bit about some of the countries where they have leaders that are maybe more authoritarian, more responding to what they think the Trump administration wants to see, acting differently. But if I remember it right, especially on the continent of Africa, there's players from the United States that are actively working to have policies that hurt LGBT folks. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah. You know, I in a globalized world, ideas travel. That's just how it is. The good ones and the bad ones. But unfortunately, when Americans started to increasingly support LGBTQI rights, there was a sector of right wing extremists that said, okay, our ideas aren't so popular here at home anymore. Let's export them
Mhm.
and let's prey upon vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities and try to get them to take up our ideas that have been discredited in the United States. And so you have right-wing actors that are going around the world and they're doing trainings and providing funding and making grants and bullying and badgering, and saying, adopt these anti-LGBTQI views. Um, and they position themselves rightly as allies of our current president and the current administration. And so I think there's a lot of unfortunate, arm twisting that's happening of governments in vulnerable situations that just really want to curry favor with our president and our government. And if they think LGBTQI people being criminalized is gonna help them, then unfortunately LGBTQI people will be sacrificed.
Yeah. Can you name some of the groups, or is that something?
I mean, one of the organizations that's been really steadfast in its anti-LGBTQI positions is, of course, the Heritage Foundation. Family Watch International is another organization that has really extremist views on LGBTQI rights. Another group is called CFAM. I mean, there are many organizations that are spreading hate around the world. They might not be as obvious as those three, but the kind of ideals that they're fighting for are, the conversion therapy practices for LGBTQI people, the elimination of marriage equality and partnership benefits for my family and maybe yours. Um, you know, um, an emphasis on parental rights without any concern about the safety and well-being of the children. So, unfortunately, opposition to comprehensive sexuality education, which is the first and most important step to ensure that they're safe for sex and consent.
Yeah.
Uh, So, unfortunately, these are really extremist ideas that don't represent how most Americans think.
Yep.
And Americans on the far extremes are exporting these ideas around the world.
Well, Jessica, thank you. I know, you did such an amazing job, and we really appreciated those of us who worked with you when I was chairing the Equality Caucus, the other members. You always were there. In fact, I appreciate you always were pushing us to be more active internationally, and you're doing your job very well. So thank you for that. Um, in the final just minute here we have, is there a way people can follow you or your current organization to know what's happening that we can share with folks?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few ways in. Thanks for asking. And Mark, you were an amazing partner when you were the chair of the Equality Caucus. I felt very lucky to work with you. And we push those we love. Uh, So, for those who want more information, I wear two hats. So, one is as a co founder of the Alliance for Diplomacy and Justice. So, join our mailing list, sign up through our website, or follow us on LinkedIn, where you can learn about work on LGBTQI rights, racial justice, trafficking in persons, and so much more, and why they matter as central pillars in U.S. foreign policy. The other thing is I'm a senior fellow at the Carr Ryan Center at the Harvard University Kennedy School, which has developed.
Well, that's awesome. Yes.
Thank you. And yeah, and we're doing amazing work over there. So people can also follow me through the Carr Ryan Center at Harvard.
Great. Well, Jessica, thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. Your amazing efforts have helped so many people around the world when you're in that position. And I just look forward to when we have a chance to bring all that back again, which I know we will. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. The world it's not waiting for us, it's counting on us.
Exactly. Exactly.